Thanks very much for coming tonight. Just a couple of announcements before we get started. First of all, we're still, if you're wondering what we're going to do in November, so are we. We haven't, the board hasn't got a chance to get together and figure out what our November program is, but we'll be doing that soon. And look for the newsletter, and we'll other places where we will announce where that will be. We also have a candidate for treasurer, which we're very happy about. And again, when the next time the board comes together, we hope to talk that over and bring it to you for approval. Anne D'Ambrosio has stepped forward and said that she would be interested in doing the treasurer's position, since Bob's on of town a lot. We'll see how that goes. Paul has some new things in the collection you want to tell people about?
We're closing on St. George's Church. Everything, all the artifacts in the church, we want to go to some basement in Boston somewhere. So I went to the church and asked for this honor roll. Everybody that went to St. George's Church that was in World War I, World War II. And the reason I was so ambitious in getting it was because my dad's in there. But what I did is I took it down to Samuel's, had 2 copies made. I gave a copy to the Legion, and they gave the copy back to the church. So they still have a copy of it. And we have it now today. So anybody that's here that's a veteran of World War II, you're not in this to do the year of the church, but St. George's. Bobby Stackers brought in these things from Carter. Right?
Bob Carter.
Bob Carter.
Right.
He was from what, Carter Furniture?
Carter Furniture, West Concord. Right.
Interesting thing though, if you want to have a chance to read something that's interesting, this is a World War II letter to Mr. Carter. It was from Irma.
Right, Irma.
It was in one of these stories.
Yeah, right. I didn't know who she was. So.
But it is from Irma to him when he was in World War II. Very, very interesting. Well, we read. Then we have Ben Proctor brought in some periodicals from St. Catherine's Church, which we know is also closed. So these are the Jubilee and some other books and so forth on different occasions that happened at the church. The only thing is this one here, we need an interpreter. This one's all in Polish. I hope Eddie can help us with that.
That's it. Thanks, Paul. Any other news or things? Are you doing something? Are you doing a presentation for Accent or something?
November 5th, Sunday.
So November 5th on Sunday, Peg's doing a presentation about her book about the Civil War veterans from the area. 3 o'clock.
Okay, one other thing too, at the Maynard Historical Library on, what is the 14th day?
Yes.
14th, which I believe is the Tuesday evening, at the public library, they have invited all Maynard authors to the library for a little get-together.
Very good.
All open to the public.
Thanks. Anything else? Anything people want to talk about? You want to see some pretty pictures? Tomorrow I'm giving the keynote at the Organization for the Assabet River at the Rod and Gun Club here in Maynard. 7:30. Take a tour of the river if you want to see. Very nice. It's our 20th anniversary for the Organization for the Assabet River. Well, then I guess we'll get to our main program tonight. With us is Stephen Wasser. Stephen's the president of Verne Q. Powell Flutes, which is right over here in the mill. That's right. Upside down. Upside down. That's your house. That's my house. Yeah. My house is over there. Thank you. Stephen's a graduate of Cornell University and has an MBA from Harvard. After school, he went into the consulting business and worked for a company called Office Specialists, where he worked to expand the national accounts there. In 1986, he purchased Powell Flutes and is now, as I said, the president of the company. He also teaches entrepreneurship at the Pulse International Business School, and he serves as a director on several companies and organizations in the area. So please welcome Stephen.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you. Good evening, everybody. You have probably looked over at the mill building, which is in that direction. And you've seen the sign on the building that says Powell Flutes, and it kind of appeared one day several years ago, and perhaps you wondered what we were doing here and who we were and what goes on back there. To the best of my knowledge, Powell is the only company in the former Maynard woolen mills that actually makes something that you can put in your hand and take away with you. It's sort of ironic to think about the history of those buildings and what went on there and what got made there, and then realize that today, for the most part, what's in there are high-tech companies doing a lot of software and services, but they're really, as far as I know, there's no company except Powell that's actually making a tangible physical product. So I think that's something that we take a lot of pride in. We still make things in America, and we have a very skilled and unusual workforce, and I'll talk a little bit about them as I go through the presentation. I do have some slides up here. It seems like it's mandatory to have a PowerPoint presentation when you do presentations these days. I have them, we'll go through them, but for the most part I'm going to ignore the PowerPoint and I'll just talk to you about the background of the company. Powell Flutes is actually, and actually it's very good, you have something back there to remind me. It says the W.A. Haynes Company. Well, the Boston world of flutes got started at the William Haynes Company. No relation, I presume, to the lumber company that's on the back wall over there. William Haynes was a jeweler for Gorham silversmiths, as I understand it, and for whatever reason decided to start this flute-making business in Boston in about 1888. So that is actually where Powell's roots come from, the Haynes Company. There actually today, I'm going to jump around in time a little bit, but today Boston is the world capital of quality flutes. It's probably not particularly well known, but if you're a flute player, you would certainly know that. Made in Boston is a big deal in the world of flutes. And it all got started with William Haynes back in the 1880s. Verne Powell was a jeweler and a flute player. I believe he was from Topeka, Kansas. And he decided, the way the story, I'm going to tell you stories about Powell. Some are true and some are not true. I'll leave it to you to sort out which is which. I'll give you hints though. The story is that as a flute player and also a silversmith and a very highly skilled engraver, he took his wife's silverware and melted it down to make a flute. And that is known today. It's still possessed by his daughter, his granddaughter or great-granddaughter, I'm not sure which, in California. It's known as the, quote, spoon flute. But it doesn't look anything like a spoon. It's just a silver flute looking like a normal silver flute. When I checked on that story, it turns out he did use a few pieces of silverware along with silver coins and other things, but he didn't really take his wife's silverware and melt the whole thing down. Anyway, he did that, made his own flute, and heard that the William Haynes Company in Boston was looking for a foreman. And this was, I believe, 1913 or so. And he sent this spoon flute to William Haynes as a sample of his work. Haynes took one look at it and offered Powell the job. He moved from Kansas to Boston, and that was about 1913. Powell became the foreman very quickly of the Haynes workshop, and he was also their primary salesperson. Mr. Powell and Mr. Haynes apparently both had fairly significant sized egos, and the Haynes Company was not large enough to contain both of them. The next story is that they had a falling out over a metal clarinet that Verne Powell designed, and that William Haynes was taking the credit for. As it turned out, it was a failure anyway, so it didn't really matter who took credit for it. But the story goes that that caused their falling out, and so after about 13 years in 1926, Powell left. He had a clear non-compete with the Haynes Company, which he proceeded to ignore, and he started making flutes in Boston in 1926 and 1927. So just to give you an idea of who we're talking about, this is an old photograph which we scanned in, so it doesn't come out too well. But this is Haynes, William Haynes, and this is Verne Powell. And this is while Powell was still working for William Haynes. And I don't know exactly the date of that. I'm guessing that's about 1920-ish or so. It has to be between 1913 and 1926. Powell then set up shop across the street from the New England Conservatory and just down the street from Symphony Hall. This is 295 Huntington Avenue. This corner over here, the next block over, is Symphony Hall, is right over there. And the photograph is taken kind of diagonally from the Huntington Avenue side of Jordan Hall at the New England Conservatory. So that is where Powell set up his workshop, and I believe he's on the second or the third floor. He was not on the first floor. And that's where the company was from the founding in 1927 until 1968 or so. And so it never became all that big during that time period because there was a limited amount of space in that location. And by the way, you can ask me questions now, you can ask me questions later. I'm going to run through my presentation fairly quickly, and then I'm assuming you'll have questions, and it's easier for me to respond to what you're interested in as opposed to what I think you might be interested in. So this is where Powell set up his business, and we have a copy of what I believe is his first brochure. It's in this binder over here. It's called, the title was The Flute Magnificent. Magnificent, yes. So he had a very high opinion of his flute, but it was actually well-deserved. By 1930, only 3 years after he opened up his business, Powell Flutes were already being played in Baltimore, Boston, Cleveland, New York, Detroit, and Philadelphia orchestras. Those were some of the top orchestras and some of the top flute players in the world at that time. Part of the reason Powell was able to do that is because as a flute player, he was the one who was going around for Haynes selling Haynes flutes. So he was the one who really had most of the contacts with the players out there. Haynes himself was not a flute player. And so Powell, in a sense, had an advantage over Haynes at that time because he was a flute player as well as a highly skilled flute maker. And that allowed him very quickly to get started. And for example, William Kincaid was kind of the Jean-Pierre Rampal of his day. William Kincaid played for the Philadelphia Orchestra, and he and Verne Powell had a very close relationship. Actually, a flute that Powell made for Kincaid became the most famous flute in the world a number of years ago. In 1939, at the New York World's Fair, the Powell Company made a platinum flute for the New York World's Fair for the Engelhardt booth. Engelhardt was and still is a company that specializes in precious metal fabrication. And they tend to specialize these days in medical materials. Platinum is one of the materials they worked in. And so Powell, at Engelhardt's request, made a platinum flute for the Engelhardt booth to display at the 1939 New York World's Fair. And on that he engraved the trilon, which was the symbol of the 1939 World's Fair. That was then displayed at the World's Fair, and we're told that William Kincaid then came by, tried the flute, and said, "This is my flute, I have to have the flute," and bought the flute. And I don't know what he paid for it, but it wasn't much by today's standards. That flute was auctioned off at Christie's, which is a major auction house in New York, in 1986 for $186,000. That was, I believe, triple the previous world record for a woodwind instrument, and as far as I know, it still stands as the highest price ever paid for a woodwind instrument. Yes?
Did Edgar Varese was he commissioned to write a piece for that flute?
Not for that flute. He did write a piece called Density 21.5, and for those of you who aren't in tech speak here, metals have a density, and one of the reasons we work with precious metals, they're very expensive, as you know. This flute over here, this is a flute that we make. This is made of 19.5 karat gold body with sterling silver keys. This flute is going to sell for $25,000. Okay, yes, it's a lot of, so don't drop it when you handle it later. So anyway, the reason precious metals are used is for actually a combination of reasons. Generally speaking, when you play the flute, the denser the metal, the warmer and darker the sound will be. Now, if you like a bright sound, that's not necessarily good, but generally speaking, flutists prefer a warmer, darker sound. When you get bright, a flute can get very edgy and almost shrill sounding. So we tend to use precious metals because they're relatively dense. The denser the precious metal, the more expensive it is. So silver, which is a density of about 10.4, depending on what scale you're using. And then you have pure gold, which has a density up around 19. When you make it into 14 karat, the density comes down, but it's still in the mid-teens there. And then you have platinum, density 21.5. And a piece was actually written for a platinum flute by Edgar Varese called Density 21.5, and it's a very famous flute piece. And so just keep in mind now, silver has a density of 10.4, platinum has a density of 21.5. That means if we make a silver flute and a platinum flute, forget the keys for the moment, just the tube, and we make them to the same specifications, that means the platinum flute is twice as heavy. All right, so this is where the density starts to make a difference in sound, but it's also a difference in cost. Another reason that we use precious metals is they tend to be very easy to work in compared to some metals. So you can find some weird metals out there that are in similar density ranges, niobium and some other things, tantalum. They're very difficult to work with. By comparison to some metals you might know, aluminum, I believe, is down around 4, density about 4. Stainless steel is a density of about 8 or 9. Copper is around 8.6. So, you know, the density is getting up there on these. The other thing is that we can make them hard. So generally speaking, density, hardness, and workability affect our choice of materials. And we want something that we can work with easily, but we make it hard and it's relatively dense. So that's sort of a long answer to your question, yes?
What would be the comparison of prices of other instruments in the symphony orchestra or any other instruments and other instruments?
Okay, and let's stick to the woodwind family because we get into violins and it's kind of a crazy world there. But if we stick to woodwinds as an example, we are very fortunate that flutists are somewhat crazy and very fussy about their instruments. So flutists are willing to pay a lot of money for their flutes in comparison to most other woodwinds. A clarinet, for example, you can go out and buy a very good clarinet, basically the top clarinet in the market, for $1,800 to $3,600. After about 10 years, you have to throw it away and get a new one because the wood shrinks. In our instruments, that's not as much of an issue, but in a clarinet, it's an issue because it's a thick piece of wood. We tend to go much thinner in the way we handle our wood. But so a clarinet, relatively cheap. An oboe is more expensive than a clarinet because it's got more keys on it, it's more complicated, but it's not that much more money. Maybe it's $6,000 to $8,000. Saxophones, you know, you can buy flutes and saxophones for very little money, but you know, professional orchestral saxophone, $5,000, something like that. Brass instruments, by and large, are relatively inexpensive. French horn is fairly complicated, and you can buy one of the top French horns in the world for about $8,000. So flutes, partly because there's precious metal in there, are expensive. Yes?
Do some of these instruments rely more on the resources of a little factory, or can they be more easily made by an individual, say in the garage or something?
There are one-man boutiques that make flutes. There are also major corporations like a division of Steinway that make flutes. They can be made in factories on a automated or semi-automated basis, and they can be made by one person from start to finish. When you're one person doing it from start to finish, there's a lot of tools and molds and dies and things like that that you might need. There are ways around that, but you know, there are people out there, they make one flute a month and they're very happy doing it. They make a reasonable profit and that's the way they live, and that's a lifestyle decision for them. So in any case, Verne Powell got established in 1927 and very quickly was a big hit with the flutists of his day. This is a photograph of Verne Powell in the 60s when he was probably 75 plus years old. He's playing the piccolo. Piccolo is actually an Italian word that means little flute. And we have a piccolo here today. This is a piccolo, and this is a flute. The piccolo is made from grenadilla wood with a sterling silver mechanism on it. And this, as you know, is gold. We'll talk a little bit more about what kind of gold it is in a short while. Now, just another little story about Verne Powell. I ran into his granddaughter at a flute convention probably 10 years ago or so. And, you know, I had this photograph in mind, and I said, well, you must have some fond memories of your grandfather. Since this is being recorded, I'll have to be careful about my answer. But she said, well, no, actually, he was a mean SOB. Anyway, he looks charming in this picture, and he was actually quite charming. If you came in to buy a flute and you complained about the flute to Mr. Powell, he would tell you to go practice. There's another story about Powell, and Jimmy Papatsakis was a very well-known and well-respected flute player with the Boston Symphony. And he also had a nice relationship with Verne Powell. And he ordered a flute from Powell. Powell made him the flute. Jimmy Papatsakis tries the flute, and he says, well, I don't know. I don't know if this is really the flute I'm going to play. And Verne turned to Jimmy Papatsakis, and he said, well, Jimmy, he said, how long you have the last flute I made for you? So, oh, 25, 30 years. He said, well, you play this one for 25 or 30 years, and then you come back and tell me whether or not you like it. So he was kind of cantankerous. This is, you know, he had a very strong personality. I suspect if Verne and I were in the same company, we would not get along so well. But that didn't happen. I never had a chance to meet him. He died in 1968, and I bought the business in 1986, so I've owned it for 20 years. I do have, by the way, a handout here which has a timeline of Powell flutes. You can pick them up later if you're interested. So I was on the New York World's Fair before. Yes, the flute got sold. That was $186,000. That was a platinum flute. We still make platinum flutes today. The platinum flutes we make today are a little different. They are not nearly as heavy. We've discovered that when you have a very heavy platinum flute, first of all, if you think about it, a flute player is way out here with the flute. That's a very uncomfortable position to hold your hands in and support a weight on your hands for an extended period of time. So weight makes a big deal for flute players. We have made a thinner version of the platinum tube, and the instrument as a result is much more responsive, and it still retains that kind of warmer, deeper quality that people are looking for if and when they play a platinum flute. Okay, so these are some pieces of the flute, which we'll come back to. This is a letter from Verne Powell to, you see the 295 Huntington Avenue. This particular letter is from 1958. I have another letter in here actually to Don Peck, who was buying his first Powell flute from Verne Powell in 1950. Don Peck became the principal flutist of the Chicago Symphony. He retired about 2 or 3 years ago. I'm still in touch with Don Peck. A very talented guy, very curious about materials. He actually ordered a platinum flute from Powell, among others. He had several, but he was known in particular for playing a platinum flute. So we have those records, some of them anyway, going back a number of years. Just in terms of the history of the company, Powell was an engraver and an artist. So he would do some very clever things, particularly at Christmas time when it came to Christmas cards. This is a later version of his card. He did all of the illustration. He writes the poetry. He writes the music. There's another one from the 30s, which is during the Works Progress Administration, and I didn't bring it with me, but he uses all kinds of acronyms from the Works Progress Administration and all the other government programs. And reading it today, at least I have no clue what he's talking about. But probably somebody from the 30s or somebody who's an expert on that historically would be able to translate for us what Powell was really talking about. But it's quite clever, I'm sure. So this, you know, again, I'm trying to give you a picture not just of the company and the history, but the kind of person who founded this company.
Would you do that for me? I can't quite see it.
I bet you were never supposing that Santa would take up composing, but that talented, fabulous creature can do it without any teacher. His symphonies, fugues, and concerti would baffle Tchaikovsky and Verdi, but his masterpiece worthy of mention is this seasonal two-part invention. And then you have 2 lines of music. Oh yeah, say that too? Yeah, I guess so. That's pretty clever also. See, if we look at it a little longer, we'll find something else in there. Okay, so Powell during, that was, again, I don't know this time period, but during World War II, it was very difficult to get materials for things as frivolous as musical instruments. So Powell actually provided about 75 piccolos sold. He didn't give them. He sold 75 piccolos to the military, which allowed him to get the materials he needed to go on making flutes during World War II. So that was kind of an interesting twist. We continue to this day to make instruments for the President's own band, the Army band, the Navy band, etc. So that is one of our customers. We don't normally sell direct to them. Typically it goes through one of our dealers in Washington, D.C. who's made a science out of selling to the military and selling to the government. It's a lot involved. I mean, you just look at pages and pages of stuff. So I'm happy to have them do it. Okay, so we come through the war, and Powell in the late 50s is getting to be fairly senior, and it's time for him to do something about succession in the company. There are 4 people who work for him who are interested in buying the company, and it takes years for them to finally negotiate this deal to sell the business, to buy the business from Verne Powell. So in 1961, Powell sells them the business, sort of. He sells them the business, but he stays there. He doesn't go anywhere. And he still tells everybody what to do. What happened then was a couple of years later, he slipped on the ice and fell and broke his wrist, and that pretty much ended his flute-making days, and from then on he stayed out of the business. And the 4 owners presumably were very thankful for that. They owned the business. Actually, 2 of them left over time, but the 2 remaining owners then sold the business to 2 other employees of the business in 1984. And during that time period, I think in about 68, they had moved from 295 Huntington Avenue to Arlington Heights, Bow Street. It's, if any of you know, it's kind of where Park Street and Mass Avenue intersect. You know, 1 block in, there's a small little street with a tiny little cinder block building, and that's where Powell was for a number of years. From actually, when I bought the business in 1986, they were still there. I relocated the business in 1989, and I recall my wife coming by to take her first look at this company I'd bought, and she looks at this 1-story cinder block building with grills on the windows and graffiti all over the outside of the walls, and she said, "What did you do?" However, she didn't seem to appreciate the fact that Powell is actually a very famous company, at least if you're a flutist. According to many people, Powell is regarded as the Stradivarius of flutes. You have the sale of the instrument to Christie's. Partly that was because of the Trilon and the New York World's Fair. It was actually sold to a man named Stuart Pivar, who was at the auction at Christie's with Andy Warhol, and I think Andy was supposedly telling Stuart to put his hand up and keep bidding. I know Dorio Dwyer from the Boston Symphony was bidding on that same flute, and Stuart Pivar outbid her. But in any case, that flute, if you want to see it, is on display at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. If you want to see some of our other flutes, you can go to the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, and they have several of our flutes that have been donated by various individuals over the years, including a gold flute and a silver flute. So the musical instrument collection of the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, which is not open all the time. You have to check the hours, and it depends what they're exhibiting. They don't always exhibit our flute, but we have several there. And then the Dayton C. Miller collection in Washington, D.C., which is affiliated with the Library of Congress, also has several Powell flutes in its collection. So you can find our flutes in various collections in the United States. Anyway, I'm kind of digressing, but so we're up to about 1986, and the company was acquired by these 2 employees, and things weren't going very well for them. They were having a lot of financial problems. They paid a lot of money for the business. They borrowed a lot of money to do it. And coincidentally, my accountant was the accountant for Powell Flutes at a time when he knew I was looking to buy a business. So he told me about Powell, and I was the one who supposedly came in to rescue the business. And I didn't know anything about making flutes, but that didn't stop me. So I bought the business in 1986. Before I go on about my tenure, I do want to read you something else about I'm actually going to read you something because it's written by somebody who wrote in really a very nice way about this particular incident with Verne Powell. And I thought I would just share it with you because I think it shows you a little bit about the people involved. This is from Dr. Albert E. Sloan, who was actually a world-famous ophthalmologist who taught at Harvard Medical School and practiced at some of the Harvard teaching hospitals in the Boston area. He retired a number of years ago. This was written by him in response to some discussions he and I had probably about 10 years ago. So this is what he describes, his experience coming to the Powell workshop to buy a flute. So he said, actually, when my young son, it was for his son, he said, when my young son needed a flute for his music lessons around 1948, I was sent to the Powell workshop where I was told he had an old used flute for sale. He was located on Huntington Avenue, close to Symphony Hall and en route to my hospital. My medical bag in hand, I met Mr. Verne Powell as arranged. He was a dignified, white-haired gentleman who was in obvious great discomfort. He was squinting one eye, which was red and tearing copiously. I was told that he was being treated for an infection for 3 months and it was getting no better. Infections that lasted a long time were not uncommon in this period before antibiotics were available. So this is 1948. The presence of a doctor's bag, like the gun in the holster of the policeman, gives the owner the feeling that he can ask questions or give orders that he would otherwise flinch from doing. Let me look at your eye, I dared to say. The same bag which gave me the authority to make my request had an opposite effect on the patient, to become submissive and show respect. This was very much out of keeping for Mr. Powell, apparently. So, without further ado, I put a drop of anesthetic from my bag into the sore eye so I could better examine him. Of course, the severe pain in his eye immediately disappeared. Mr. Powell was enormously impressed with my skill at so quickly removing his discomfort. A magnifying glass and a good light, in addition to the sight in my young eyes, showed that what he had was not an infection, but a tiny sliver of metal, deeply embedded in the front surface or cornea of his eye. I went to my bag, put another drop in his eye to ensure good anesthesia, and then, with a sterile instrument, promptly removed the foreign body. In 12 hours, he was completely cured and free of symptoms. Well, from then on, we had a special relationship which led me to taking flute lessons at age 42, and of course, buying a Verne Q Powell flute. In 1952, I decided to have the open key model. My teacher, Jimmy Papatsakos, remember I told you a different story about Jimmy Papatsakos buying a flute from Powell. My teacher, Jimmy Papatsakos, who was also a patient of mine and lived 6 doors away, and because the wait was normally 2 years, Jimmy recommended a flute which had just been made for him, number 1142. It's probably the one he didn't like, that, that he was trying to give back to Mr. Powell. Mr. Powell was kind enough to engrave this flute with his own signature as sort of personal thanks for helping him overcome his eye problem. And incidentally, the only Powell flute with such an inscription. And I've seen that flute. So, you know, some nice stories about Verne Powell and, in this case, Dr. Albert Sloan, who is a very famous retired ophthalmologist and also an amateur flute player. There are actually a significant number, I don't know, significant. We sell mostly our flutes to professionals and aspiring professionals. There is a smaller portion of the market which I'll call wealthy amateurs. Typically these are men who in middle age decide they want to play the flute. But they're successful at their professional endeavor. They have enough money and they don't want to start with a student instrument. They want to start with a professional instrument. And they come and they buy a flute. And you know, that's not a lot a year, but it's fun because those are usually interesting people with motivation. They're not trying to become the next great professional flute player. So that's a fun part of the market for us. Okay, where are we? That's an old price list. Okay, but we do have a website which has a wonderful factory tour that includes sound bites from some of the people who work at Powell. Because I don't have an internet connection here, that would have actually been the easiest way to give you a factory tour. I can't give you the same slides. The ones on the internet are much better than what I've been able to conjure together for tonight's presentation. But I'm going to talk a little bit about how we make a flute, what's involved in this. And then we'll come to actually some of our customers, which is interesting as well. A flute is an instrument. What makes a flute a flute? A flute is a tube, and it's got a hole in at least one part of the tube, and you blow across the hole. You're blowing transversely, like the old Coke bottle thing. Ooh, you blow across the Coke bottle and it goes, ooh. Okay, that's what you have to do with a flute. A recorder, by comparison, or a clarinet, you're blowing into the hole, not across the hole. You blow into it. Every other woodwind instrument, you are blowing into the hole. The flute is different. You blow across the hole. That's what makes a flute a flute. It can be as long or as short as you want. It can have lots of holes, or it can have very few holes. It can have keys or not have keys. But there are flutes going back to the Stone Age that are made out of bone. They've discovered flutes made out of all kinds of materials. So this is a very, very old instrument. So at its most basic, it's a tube, a hollow tube, with a hole in it that you blow across, and it makes a sound. That's a flute. Okay. Pretty much everything we do is working in the round. So a lot of our tools, our equipment has to be able to work around. A lot of tools, for example, we have a tool maker back here. You're working in 2 dimensions, X and Y. We're working X, Y, and radially as well. So that has some additional challenges for making things. And we work in precious metals. Generally fairly easy to work with. They solder well. Machining is a mixed bag. Silver is kind of gummy. When we work in gold, we're working typically in carat gold, not pure gold. Pure gold is 24 karat. It is very heavy, it's very expensive, and it's very soft. When you want to make jewelry or anything mechanical, you have to mix the gold with something else. 14 karat means 14 24ths. Right? That's 58.4%. So 12 karat, as an example, would be 50% gold and 50% something else. It doesn't matter what the something else is. So when people talk about carats, I don't know why this system evolved, but an 18 karat necklace, for example, is 75% gold, 18 24ths. That's how it works. So when you want to make gold hard, you mix it with something else. So anytime we work with gold, we've mixed it with something else. In 14 karat, 18 karat, and we typically use rose gold, which we have an example of here, gold is pretty hard. Silver is actually relatively soft. Not a great material for something structural and mechanical like that, but it's traditional, so we do what the customers expect. Okay. See what I can show you here without... All right, the flute, we start with the body of the flute. And we have a whole department that makes parts, and some of the parts are made for us by special machine shops, both in the United States and out of the United States. But as soon as it starts looking like a flute, starting with the tube, it's made here by us. And most of the parts we do ourselves. Most of our tooling we make ourselves, because you don't go to the tool store and buy tools for making a flute. There are no such tools. There are no such... there's no such equipment designed specifically for flute making. So we have to design and make most of our own tools. Okay, so we take those tools and we take people with good skills and we start putting flutes together. We're constantly inspecting and checking specifications, making sure that the measurements are right. It is very difficult to take 2 flutes with exactly the same specifications and truly make them identical. There are all kinds of things that come into play. When you heat metal, when you solder it, things move. The metal expands when you heat it. And so we run into lots of odd little problems when we try to make a flute, but we are constantly checking to make sure that things are accurate. This is an example of somebody working on a relatively modest little lathe over there. Castings, anybody here have jewelry custom made for you? You ever see the jeweler working in wax? So they'll take a piece of wax and they'll work on it, and then voila, a few weeks later you come up with a silver or a gold something or other that looks like that piece of wax. That's the process that we're using here. We do some of our own casting. We also send some castings out. These are actually, they look very pretty. These are pieces of wax which will eventually become flute parts that have been created from a rubber mold. And we have a cavity in that rubber mold that we've created, and we shoot the wax into the rubber mold. We pull the wax out. We put it up on this tree. We actually melt it with a little, like ironing wand. We melt it onto the tree. And I think we're going to be able to show you the rest of this. That's silver casting grain that we are going to melt to make these parts. So what happens is that tree is inside this flask, and this white stuff on top is basically something like plaster of Paris. So you put plaster of Paris around that wax, you melt out the wax, now you have a cavity inside, and then you put molten silver inside. So she is taking this flask, the wax has been burned out, and she's taking it and she's putting it in the casting machine over here. That's Wendy. And that is silver. That is, you can actually see little speckles of the grain is still melting over here, but that is a red hot, that's melting at about 1,700 degrees Fahrenheit or so, 1,600 degrees Fahrenheit. And she's waiting until the time and until the temperature and the color look right to her. Then she'll release the silver into the mold, and it will fill. And you're going to wind up with a tree that looks like that wax tree, but now it's going to be silver parts or gold parts. And then we cut them off. And so here are, this is an example of a flute lever, and this is what connected it to the tree. You see, that's called the gate. That's what lets the silver into the part, and eventually we have to cut that off and clean it up so that it looks like. Here's another gate running into this part. Here are some more gates. So those are castings. These other parts, these are machined. Some of these are forged, made from dies. There's a mixture of ways that we make things at the company. I don't know, there's some of you forgings, castings, dies, those mean anything, so I'm going to move along. Flute parts are really small. Most of the work is done by hand. We will use wheels to help us, but we're holding it by hand against those wheels. And this is just an example. In Maynard, we have actually, this is the only, you see the wooden floor? This is the only wooden floor the landlord was able to salvage in building 1 of Clock Tower Place. The rest of the floors were in really bad condition, and they struggled just to get this floor. But we have a pretty decent floor over here. And this is an example of the way 3 people working, they're each working on a flute. This is not an assembly line operation. Each one is making the mechanism for a flute. So they're going to get that body tube with some of the parts on it. And now they're going to, if I go back, they're going to get something that looks like this. And they're going to say, OK, make a flute out of this. All right, so what they're going to do is take those parts, and they're going to make the keys, all the keys that go up and down on the flute. Now, there'll be one more stage in the manufacturing process. People will actually have to make fine adjustments on here, polish it, put the pads in so that everything works the way it's supposed to. But the mechanism of the flute, those keys are made by the people that you see over here. That's only a portion of the department. We have about 75 people working at Powell Flutes. And we also have a very international workforce. You need any Polish speakers. We have 2 of them working at Powell Flutes. And then they still speak Polish.
How long does it take to make them?
It will take 100 to 150 assembly hours. That doesn't include making, and again, it depends on which flute we're talking about. There are other flutes that we make at a lower price point. Our cheapest flute retails for $4,000. So that flute might take us 50 hours, 40 hours of assembly time. It does not include fabricating all the parts. This is just putting them all together. And on the calendar, we are working very hard to deliver our instruments on time with mixed success. But normally, if you were to order a flute today, assuming we have the capacity, which we don't, we are actually back ordered. But if we had the capacity and started your flute tomorrow, by the time it kind of works its way through, it would be about 2 to 3 months. If we really hustled and focused on it and pushed it through, it might be 6 to 8 weeks. 6 weeks, I guess. Lean manufacturing, just in time, doesn't really work for us too well. For those of you who aren't in manufacturing, just-in-time inventory, you'll see this associated with Toyota and General Motors, and they use today's inventory, and then their supplier comes driving up with tomorrow's inventory, and they put it on the shelf, and it just kind of keeps flowing right through. They're very fast turn of their parts. We have just-in-case inventory. So, You know, we order something and our supplier takes 8 weeks to make it. And then they send it to us and we inspect it and it's defective. So we send it back and they say, okay, no problem, 3 more weeks. And they take 3 more weeks. And so we have a lot of inventory just to protect ourselves, because if we're missing one part, we can't make the flute. So it's a big problem for us, and inventorying gold and silver is expensive. It's like taking cash and putting it on the shelf. That's what gold and silver does to your cash flow. So we have a lot of just-in-case inventory. We have a more traditional way of organizing. We are doing some things to implement some of the more contemporary manufacturing techniques like lean manufacturing, creating more visible inventory systems, trying to have certain people work more in teams as opposed to kind of one man, one flute setup. But it's, you know, we're still a fairly traditional shop in the way we're organized. Okay. This is soldering with a torch. And one of the most interesting thing about this to me is, where's the jig? Where's the fixture? There is none. Most of the work we do is by hand and by eye. The most sophisticated fixture you're going to see for the people who are doing this particular job is like a little wire grasshopper. That's about it. Almost everything they do is by hand and by eye. So there's a lot of skill required. Our work, one of the reasons we're in the building we're in, this is expensive space. I mean, most of the rest of the companies are renting it as office space. So for them, it's cheap space. But for us, it's expensive space. We do that because our workforce is not kind of the traditional factory workforce. These tend to be highly educated people who have a certain view of themselves, and we want them to see themselves in a certain way because we're making what is supposed to be the best flute in the world. And so we want our environment to reflect the quality of our product and the attitudes and skills of our workers. We also have famous flutists and non-famous flutists who come to visit us, and they expect to see a certain kind of environment. They don't necessarily want to see a factory. We don't even use the word factory. We're the shop, the workshop. Santa's workshop. They expect to see Santa's workshop. And really, in some respects, we're a combination of Santa's workshop, a jeweler, and a machine shop. And if you go to our 4th floor, which is the top floor of the building, that's pretty much our machine shop. Santa's workshop is more on the 3rd floor. And that, when we give the customers the tour, we only show them the 3rd floor. They don't want to know about the machinery. They think everything's made by hand. Which brings me to another story about Verne Powell. There is a myth. When you're a famous company, there is a myth around your products and about the founder of the company. So there is a whole market out there. One of the good things, if you buy a Powell flute, it's not an expense, it's an investment. So it's kind of like buying a really good Oriental rug, and you go to sell it 10 years later and you can sell it for at least what you paid for it and maybe get more. That's kind of the same thing with a Powell flute. So there is a very active resale market for used Powell instruments, and they tend to go up in value over time. Flute number 2000, and just as a precursor to this discussion, Powell exports about 50% of what we make. So if there's a balance of trade problem in this country, it's not because of Powell flutes. We are exporting a very substantial amount of our production. And we export all over the world. Our biggest export market is Japan, which is home to the largest flute makers in the world. So we're selling right into their backyards, and believe me, they're not happy about it. We have been declared public enemy #1 by the Muramatsu Flute Company, which is fine with us. Okay, so flute number 2000 was made by Mr. Powell. At least everybody thinks that Mr. Powell made all the flutes. The reality is that Mr. Powell had workers, just like I have workers. He didn't have 75, but he had at least a half a dozen workers. And, but in any case, while Mr. Powell owned the company, the myth is that he made everything himself. So I was in Japan, where our dealer is extremely fussy. You know, each country has different ways of looking at the instrument. In the United States, they care primarily how does it play. So the first thing they do when they get their new flute is they pick it up, they play it. If it plays great, they love it. In Japan, the first thing they do is inspect it to see what they can find wrong cosmetically with the flute. And I won't get into why I think that's the case, but that's how they are. And we have to respect that because they're very important customers, and they buy a lot of flutes, particularly gold flutes, which is profitable for us. So I'm there, and I've just had a meeting with my Japanese dealer who's given me a long list of complaints about our flutes. Here are all the things wrong with your flutes. You know, and specifically, I remember him complaining that the tolerance of the key over the tone hole, there's a tone hole here, there's an opening in the flute, and this key has to close over that tone hole, and it's supposed to be centered to the tone hole. And we have gauges that determine whether or not that's properly centered. They're accurate to our tolerance is about 2 to 3 thousandths of an inch. Okay, what is 2 to 3 thousandths? Your hair is 3 thousandths of an inch thick. So that's the tolerance we're working to. So my dealer is busy telling me that we're not meeting the tolerance on the centering of our cups over the tone holes. And I said, well, gee, I'm really sorry. You know, we use gauges and we check it, but you know, we'll try to make sure it's right, etc. So, okay, now we go out for drinks, which is very popular in Japan as well. And we meet one of his customers, a flute player. And he comes in and he says, this is number 2000. This was Jeffrey Gilbert's flute. So, okay, great. This is Mr. Powell made it. So immediately the halo is all around this flute. So, and he wants me to actually look at the flute and, you know, check it out and tell him it's great. So I look at the flute. And I've also figured out by now this is one of the customers who's making the complaints, because there's a myth out there that the only good Powell flute is an old Powell flute, one that Verne made. Right? So that's one of the things we combat as a company. The reality is that many of our flutes today are considerably better than the flutes that were made 50 years ago, but that's not the myth. And we don't want to destroy the myth, because part of what makes us special today is the myth about the old flutes. So there's a delicate balancing act that goes on. But clearly he's the one who's been fanatical about all these quality issues. So he wants me to inspect this flute. So I inspect the flute, I look at it, and I see that the trill tone holes, the cups, these two things over here, these are trill keys, all right? They're literally bent up the flute by about 1/4 of an inch each. And I look at it, and I showed that to him. I said, gee, did you see this? He said, oh, no. Well, you know, this was very interesting. This man can determine that we are off by 2 thousandths of an inch on the centering of our cups over the tone holes, but he doesn't see that this is bent, 1/4 was probably an exaggeration, 1/8 of an inch up the flute. 1/8 is 125 compared to 0.002 versus 0.125. All right? So what happened here? Either Powell or one of his workers realized that it wasn't centered over the tone hole, and they didn't feel like remaking the key, so they took their thumb and they bent it up the flute. Okay, so this really, the point of that story, aside from telling you how particular the Japanese customers are and kind of describing what it's like to live with the myth of the founder of the company, but also to show you that Verne Powell wasn't quite the perfectionist that he was always reputed to be. I have seen some absolutely incredible flutes that he's made, and his engraving was spectacular. He was particularly known for his engraving work. Okay, I'm getting a little bit side. Polishing flutes. We spend a lot of time making things look beautiful. It has no practical functional value for the customer. 2 weeks after you've gotten your brand new, slickly polished flute, it makes no difference what we did, but it's got to look good when you open up that box. These people are padding our flutes. So those other people have made the keys, and now these people are responsible for putting in the pads. You can see the blue tape. That's to protect the flute from getting scratched. Jamie is a flute player. Jing Fen is not, but she's a very talented finisher, padder for us, and she's from China. Jamie is from Texas. Amy is one of our testers. We have several professionally trained flutists who test our instruments. No flute leaves our factory until it's been inspected ad nauseum and play tested by a professionally trained flutist. And it almost never gets approved the first time around. There's usually some back and forth between the tester and the person who is padding the instrument. And this is Amy. Amy is testing a flute here. And she actually, that's interesting traditionally speaking here. Verne Powell worked with William Kincaid, who was the top flutist of his day. William Kincaid was the teacher of Dorio Dwyer. Dorio Dwyer was the teacher of Amy Carroll. So we have continuity. Zufang Le is our head joint master. This is a gentleman who was from China, where he was the principal with the Shanghai Movie Orchestra. He also composed numerous movie scores. Somebody took his music and used it in a way that Madame Mao didn't like, so he wound up in jail. And when he got out of jail, he burned all his music because he did not want to have to deal with this, and he left the country and came to the United States, which was unfortunate because his music is beautiful. In the United States, he got his master's at Peabody Conservatory, went to work for a student flute company, and wound up at Powell Flutes about 18 years ago or so, a few years after I bought the business, and he's fantastic. He can do anything. And he's now training his successors. He's around 60 years old, so he's very conscious of making sure that there's somebody to take over for him. Okay, so that's kind of a quick run through of, quick, not so quick, of how we make flutes. If you really want to find a better description of making flutes, go on our website. There's a factory tour on our website. Make sure you have your sound on the computer. If you don't know how to do that, there's a library upstairs. Maybe they can help you with that. Okay, Dorio Dwyer, that's a very old photograph of Dorio Dwyer on the right. She was the first principal player of a major symphony orchestra in the United States who was female. And she was the principal flutist of the Boston Symphony for, I think, over 40 years. She still is active in the flute world. And Fenwick Smith just retired. He was the second flute in the Boston Symphony, an outstanding flutist. And he's doing a lot of tour work right now. So you see some of the quotes from Dorio Dwyer. There's always been a special sound to a Powell flute, which I feel is ringing and true. It's a wonderful sound that can fill up a hall. And Dorio Dwyer, the year she was retiring, tried out a platinum flute from us. And she wanted to take it on a trip to Japan with the orchestra, which was like their final trip that she was going to be playing. And so she took it to Japan, and she came back and called me from Seattle, and she said, well, I have a problem. I said, what's the problem? She said, well, I'm supposed to send this flute back to you, but I don't want to do that. I said, well, you know, that's up to you. She said, well, I went into hall in Japan, the acoustics of their concert halls tend to be not very good. And she said, I went into these really bad halls in Japan, and she said, this flute just carried right through the last row of the concert hall. She says, I can't give it up. So Dorio Dwyer bought herself a retirement gift, which is her platinum Powell flute. And just a quick aside, we do not have any formal endorsement deals with flutists. We do not pay anybody to play our flutes. Any quotes or endorsements are freely offered by the flutist, and what they get from us is thank you. These are two famous European artists. Maxence Larieux is kind of the French heir apparent to Jean-Pierre Rampal, although not nearly as famous, but he's certainly a highly respected flutist. Raffaele Trevisani is Italian, and he's an up-and-coming young flutist. Now, the person who put this together believes that Europe and Britain are two separate places. Now, many of you probably have heard of Jethro Tull. That was a rock group, still is a rock group. Ian Anderson is the principal of that group. He owns several Powell flutes, and he says, Rolex watch, Mercedes CLK, Leica camera, Powell flute. Just 4 of my prized possessions. Guess which one paid for the other 3? The Powell flute. Purity of tone, perfect intonation, mechanical excellence, the true instrument of seduction. Now, part of what's unusual about that is he's in the world of rock music where endorsements are really popular, common. I went through, we gave a list. We had a public relations firm we hired a few years ago, and we gave them a long list of quotes by famous flutists, and they said, well, what do you have to pay for these? And I said, nothing. They were flabbergasted. They couldn't believe that. And it is very typical in the music industry that people pay for endorsements or they give away instruments. We just don't do that, partly because if you're Yamaha, you can afford to give Ian Anderson your top-of-the-line flute in the hopes that he's then you'll be able to use him as an endorser, and a whole bunch of other people are going to buy regular flutes because of that. Well, we don't have that. We don't have that kind of product line. All of our customers, in one way or another, can claim to be famous or would like to be famous, and if we do a special deal for one, the next one says, well, I'm just as famous as that one. What are you going to do for me? So we don't do it. We do say thank you. We'll, you know, if they want to, we may send them on tour to do a master class or something like that, but we don't pay anything. Paul Edmund Davis is probably the top player in UK. He is the former principal flutist with the London Symphony. He stepped down because he wanted to do more solo work, and he's got pulled back into the Philharmonia Orchestra, who needed a principal flutist. But he is a terrific flutist, and he does a lot of trips for us. Okay, this is if you go to our website, this is kind of what you're going to see. It goes through a flash introduction, and you come to this page. And then if you wanted to go to the factory tour, for example, you'd click on the workshop, and you'd see a drop-down. It would have a bunch of things, including factory tour. We also have the recording studio, which is a place where famous flutists give us tracks of their music, which people can download. Some of those tracks are free, and some people have to pay for. So if you're sophisticated with your computer and you like flute music, you can go to the recording studio and download some of the tracks from famous flutists for free. You will have to register, though. So this is the recording studio. This is what that page looks like. You get an artist. There's a search feature. You can search by artist name. You can search by type of music, etc. The future. It's very difficult to innovate in a business where your product pretty much hasn't changed for 75 to 100 years. I mean, a flute today is pretty much the same as a flute that was made in 1927 by Verne Powell. So how do you innovate in that business where the traditional classic musician expects the same thing that they got before, but just kind of the latest version? Well, somehow we've managed to do that. We have a bunch of patents. This particular material is silver inside, gold on the outside. It's what's called a clad material. It's metallurgically fused together. We have a patent on that. We were the first company to try 19.5 karat gold. We had numerous requests, particularly from Japan, for 18 karat gold, and we had horrible problems trying to get 18 karat rose gold. 18 karat yellow gold is easy to work with. 18 karat rose gold is very difficult. And our supplier was getting so frustrated, they gave up, and instead they developed 19.5 karat and said, try it. So we went out and we bought $50,000 or $100,000 worth of 19.5 karat gold, not having any idea how it would work. It worked great. So we came out with 19.5 karat. That's what you see here, and it's the flute that I brought with me today. It's a 19.5 karat body with sterling silver mechanism. And then off on the right, that is a piccolo. This piccolo looks pretty much like that piccolo. I won't get into the difference. It's not worth it. But this little piccolo here, this little thing, this is $4,000. The one on the screen is only $2,300. Right? That's our cheap version of this instrument. So what we did with the flute is we designed the flute. They're currently made for us in Asia, but we're about to start up production in Germany with a company that makes world-famous woodwind instruments, and surprisingly is price competitive with China. And we provide the head joint. We make the head joint here in the mill building. The reason for that is on a flute, the head joint represents about 50% or more of the quality of the sound, but it's only about 10% of the cost. Most of the labor goes into making these keys go up and down. But most of the sound quality is up here. So we make those head joints. We put our head joint on the flute that's made for us, and we put it out under the Sonari brand, and that's been very successful. And that continues to expand. And we actually have a trumpet as well. And the trumpet is a joint venture between, we've coordinated all this. Cliff Blackburn is the top handmade trumpet maker in the United States. He's based in Decatur, Tennessee. It's Cliff, his wife Bunny, and his assistant. That's it. That's the whole workshop. They have no internet connection. It's only dial-up. There's no broadband. There's no DSL. But Cliff makes the lead pipe, kind of the head joint concept, and the body of the trumpet is made for us in Germany. And it's gotten excellent feedback from customers, and we're trying to expand that product line. So that is I'm sure I've left stuff out of my presentation, but that's kind of an overview of the history of the company, how we make things and the kind of people who play it, as well as what the future perhaps looks like. So I'm more than happy to take questions. I can do my best to answer. Questions? Yes?
I'd like to tell you why I came here and ask one question. I'm here because about a month ago, a college friend of mine I'm still in touch with said that she'd always felt when we were in college in the mid-'70s that if she had a Powell flute, even back then, it was so well known that she would have done much better on the flute. I mean, she was, I think she was the principal in the wind orchestra of a university with 50,000 students. So that wasn't too bad, but she went on to go into library science. I don't know if she thought she'd be a professional, but she obviously thought the Powell flute was very impressive. The other reason I'm here is that on the day that I was laid off from Digital Equipment Corporation, my cubicle was 40 feet behind your sign. But the one question is to ask you if you make any historical instruments.
By historical, you mean?
Baroque recreation, you know, the pre-Verne fingering.
No, we do not make any pre-Bame flutes. We make only contemporary Bame-style flutes. Bame is the style, or he's the originator of what is today's flute. And we only make modern flutes, basically, is the answer. And in answer to the implied question, all of our customers expect to become better flutists when they buy one of our flutes. And, you know, to some degree, it does make a difference. We've heard that, but you know, it depends on the level of the player and what they're comparing it to. Are they coming off a Yamaha or a Maynard? Are they coming off a Haynes flute? And the differences start to get smaller. Other questions? Yes, John, is it? No, not John. What's your name?
Oh, Len.
Len, yes.
Yeah, is that powellflutes.com?
It's powellflutes.com. www.powellflutes.com. Yes, David?
This is obviously like one part manufacturing and two parts craftsmanship or whatever. What's the opportunity or the chances of a flute making it all the way through the process and your professional plays it and just says, this can't be fixed? I mean, do you ever melt them down and start over again? Or, I mean,
it's happened. That's really rare.
Yeah.
Usually, if a flute gets to that stage and is not playing right, we got two issues. One is cosmetics and one is how is it playing. If it's not playing right, we can usually diagnose the problem and fix it. If it is to the point where it's over-polished or it was done by somebody new and they just didn't do a good job and somehow it got up to the last stage, we'll scrap it. But that's really rare. We don't like that. Yeah. They are. Haynes is kind of a sad story, though. They are, actually, I'm not sure where they literally are today. The Haynes company didn't really change or innovate at all. They kind of stayed stuck in the mud. And they had about 10 or 15 people maybe 3 years ago. And I offered to buy the company because the founder had died and the wife was running it into the ground, even though she was trying to. She just couldn't do it. She didn't know anything about making flutes. And we had a deal to buy the company, and at the last minute, a Chinese man who has a business in China and a business in the United States bought the business. And he's now, in the last 3 years, he's gone through 4 general managers, and currently, I believe they have to leave their space in the South End because the seller wants to sell the building, and they're not doing very well right now. They are, with using their connection to China, to actually make sub-assemblies in China and bring them into the country here and try to put it together. You know, it could have been different, but they're not a significant competitor right now. Len? Do we have a? We buy. First of all, anything we buy is fabricated for us, so we don't just buy bars of gold. We buy tubing, we buy flat sheet of gold, we buy rods, we buy casting grain. So when we buy gold, we're buying it from suppliers typically in Attleboro, Massachusetts. Stern Leach is the big company down there. And they put it in the form that we require. We pay them a fabrication charge over and above the cost of the gold or the silver to get it in the form that we want it. So for example, on a tube like this, we might pay whatever the cost is for the silver or the gold, and then we might pay $5 an ounce just to put it in the form of a tube. So it gets to be substantial costs. We do sometimes buy bullion, actual just raw gold, and it's all done electronically. We'll buy it from the bank or we'll buy it from Stern Leach, and they will put it kind of on credit for our account, and then when they use the gold, instead of selling us the gold, they just take it out of our gold account. We buy the gold when we think the market price for gold is at an attractive point. We'll just go out and buy, $100,000 or $200,000 worth of gold, and that's, cash. It's just cash. Okay. Other questions? Okay. Thank you. Thank you. I have, if you'd like, and you're careful, you can fondle our $25,000 gold flute, our $4,000 piccolo. You might also find it interesting. This is a piece of granadillo wood. This comes from Africa, from Mozambique or Tanzania. It is a very dense wood, heavy, and it comes from the impingo tree, which is not a tropical hardwood, contrary to what people think. It is a savanna wood. Most of this disappears from Africa because they burn it to farm things, but we use it for musical instruments. So that's wood, and then we have just a flute tube here. These are holes. I won't even get into the manufacturing. Forget it. These are the manufacturing. We have, if you're interested, there's a Powell brochure here, as well as a Sonari flute brochure. So you're welcome to take them if you like. I also have, I'll put this on this table. This is kind of the timeline from 1927 to the present. So those are little things for you to play with.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Appreciate it.
Okay.